So I got a question for you. Did today's featured artist just make too much music? I mean, we're talking 20 studio albums in about 3 decades. That's a new album every year and a half. During the 80s alone, this guy churned out 8 #1 hits and 21 big hits overall. I mean, the numbers are staggering. But was it overkill? When is enough when it comes to your favorite musicians? Overexposed and getting their reputation for going a little too vanilla pop after being a rocker, he decided to shake things up. So he took a chance on a more serious subject. He wrote a song that was self-indictment and it made him question his own humanity. When he released it, it caught everybody's attention. It was a #1 hit, but he took a lot of heat for it. You're gonna see why coming up next. A great story, very interesting about this song, coming up on Professor of Rock. Hey music junkies, Professor of Rock, always here to celebrate the greatest artists and the greatest songs of all time. You know, if you remember playing Payday or any of the other classic Parker Brothers board games when you were growing up, you're gonna dig this channel of deep musical nostalgia. Make sure to subscribe below right now, click the big red button and click the bell so you always know when our latest and greatest are coming out. Also, check us out on Patreon. We have more content there. Also, check out our merch that helps us to keep it a daily channel. Today, we're coming back to one of your favorite artists, definitely one of mine. He's a man who's very well respected on this channel. His videos have done well, as should be. And he really has no shortage of hits to choose from. Talking about the great Phil Collins, or as we affectionately call him on here, Uncle Phil. Good old Uncle Phil. And for the latest edition of the Collins saga, we're actually going to cover the lead single from his 1989 multi-platinum album, But Seriously, a song that's actually become his most streamed song ever. It's even passed up in the air tonight. Talking about Another Day in Paradise. A lot of you are going to be shocked by that. Phil Collins, the man who sang lead vocals on 8 #1 hits in the 80s and was arguably the busiest musician of the decade. I mean, from 1980 to 1989, Collins released a total of 8 albums between Genesis and his solo career. Phil also contributed hit songs to multiple soundtracks. Of course, Philip Bailey's Chinese Wall, which he also produced. Speaking of production, I mean, Phil likewise earned production credits on albums for Eric Clapton, Frida, Adam Ant, The Four Tops, and Howard Jones. He also lent his services as a drummer on 2 Robert Plant albums, throwing an appearance on Miami Vice and a same-day 2-continent performance for Live Aid. And well, I think you get the idea here. Phil Collins was everywhere in the 80s, the hardest working man in showbiz. But leading up to today's track, I want to zero in on his solo career for a minute to give you a little bit of context as we get into this. Collins' first solo album, Face Value, that was released in February of '81. It's actually sold 11 million copies worldwide. Phil's debut went to #7 on the Billboard 200 here in the States. It also featured 2 top 20 singles in the US, I Missed Again, and the ever so haunting In the Air Tonight. Following Face Value's triumphant breakout, Collins returned with his next solo project, Hello, I Must Be Going. This was in November of '82. It was also successful. Hello, I Must Be Going, that hit #8 on the US charts, featured the top 40 hit, I Don't Care Anymore, and the #10 cover of the Supremes' You Can't Hurry Love. 1984 was a huge year for Phil Collins. He got his first #1 hit as a solo artist, talking about the soundtrack single Against All Odds, and also the #2 double Phil duet with Philip Bailey, Easy Lover. Both are 80s essentials. February of 1985, Collins returned with his landmark 25 million seller No Jacket Required. That featured 4 US top 10 hits, the #1 Sussudio and One More Night. And of course, in between all these albums, Collins was putting out Genesis records as well. 1986 saw their biggest LP yet, Invisible Touch. The record scored Phil another 5 top 5 hits, including the #1 hit Invisible Touch. He also had a duet with Marilyn Martin that hit #1, Separate Lives. So just for context, in 7 years, Phil Collins tallied 22 top 40 hits on the Billboard Hot 100. That comes out to just over 3 hit singles a year for 7 straight years. That's Beatles territory. And hey, that is a lot of Phil Collins. Fearing he was in danger of going full Phil overkill here, Collins stepped it back in the late 80s. He redirected into creative energies into film, took the lead role of Buster Edwards in 1988's adventure comedy Buster, but Collins being Collins still contributed to the soundtrack, and in the process, he scored 2 more #1 singles. He couldn't help himself. The 2 chart toppers were his cover of the Mindbenders' A Groovy Kind of Love and the Motown classic Two Hearts. He wrote that with Lamont Dozier.
Got a groovy kind of love.
Okay, so that brings us up to speed to our feature album today and featured song from But Seriously. But Seriously was released on November 20th, 1989, and it barely counts as an 80s album, just got in there. Even though he'd released a lot of music in the 80s, it was actually Phil's first solo album in almost 5 years. He was well aware that he was in danger of oversaturating the market with his own brand of vanilla pop. Having that in mind, Phil took a long look at the type of songs he'd been releasing in recent years. Many of his new album songs were written in an attempt to offset what he would call his previous middle-of-the-road song choices. If his early 80s output was characterized by scathing divorce diatribes, the mid-80s saw Collins starting to soften up a bit. Then after covering A Groovy Kind of Love, Phil realized that he was becoming a little more trivialized than he wanted to be. His words, not mine. So, But Seriously was undertaken with a new perspective in mind. One, like the album's title suggests, that was more serious. After a year and a half of writing, Phil had more than enough material. And looking at what he had, he called the record the strongest thing he'd released since Face Value. Those were big words, which is saying a lot considering his substantial 80s output. The 12-track LP would include contributions from Daryl Strumer, Eric Clapton, Steve Winwood, Stephen Bishop, David Crosby, and also the Phoenix Horns. But Seriously spawned 4 hit singles and topped the charts on both sides of the Atlantic, staying at #1 in the UK for an impressive 8 weeks, 2 months. Perhaps the song that best sums up Phil's new approach on the album is our featured track today, Another Day in Paradise. Collins would say that he chose it for the record because it was different from what he'd done recently.
Think twice,
the idea here was to remind people who he truly was. This was the in the air tonight guy, if you will, meaning he wasn't afraid to tackle heavier themes. And the theme of Another Day in Paradise was far from inconsequential. It deals with homelessness. In fact, the working title was actually the word homeless. Phil has told a couple of stories that influenced the creation of this song. In one, he talks about coming out of a recording studio in London and being approached by a homeless mother. And, she asked him for some money. But Phil chose to just keep walking. The song actually alludes to this in the very first verse, this interaction. She calls out to the man on the street, "Sir, can you help me? It's cold and I have nowhere to sleep. Is there somewhere you can tell me?"
Is there somewhere you can tell me?
Now, as Phil said, and I quote, "When it happened to me, I just walked straight past. I thought, I'm doing the same thing as everybody else. I felt awkward. I didn't ignore her, but at the same time, I didn't stop and give her some money." That's what this song deals with. People just sort of starting to pretend it's not happening. End of quote. Now, after this interaction, Phil's heart was pierced and he started to notice evidence all around him of homelessness, wherever he went.
Sir, can you help me?
The other story that Collins tells happened on Genesis's Invisible Touch tour. The band was driving through Washington, D.C., and Phil asked their driver about the many cardboard boxes that he saw along the sidewalk in the shadow of the Capitol building. Collins' driver replied with just one word: homeless. Phil, in his words, was gobsmacked. homeless, so many of them, so close to all the wealth and power in the capital of the United States. He thought it was extraordinary. He thought it was an extraordinary contradiction. It was winter out and people were sleeping on the grills where all the hot air was coming up. These images stuck with him, and Collins started noticing the boxes wherever they played. It definitely opened his eyes. All this unexpectedly came back to him when he was working on But Seriously. Talking about how Another Day in Paradise came together, Collins said, and I quote, "It was begun at the piano. I started playing and put it down on tape so I wouldn't forget it. Then I decided to see what would happen when I started singing. When I began, the words, they just came out. She calls out to the man on the street. I didn't set out to write a song about the homeless. Those were just the words that I happened to sing. It was only then that I decided that that was what this song would be about." Joining Collins on vocals for Another Day in Paradise was one of his heroes, David Crosby. He said, "I just love him so much. I was in bands that did covers of the Byrds and Crosby, Stills, and Nash." Actually, Phil Collins had wanted to collaborate with Crosby on Face Value, but it never worked out. Collins and Crosby would later meet for the first time at an Atlantic Records anniversary concert that happened in 1988. There, Phil asked him to contribute some vocals on his album. In Collins' words, "David did exactly what I expected him to do. He just picked a few notes out of the air that I would never have thought of." According to Collins, when it came time to choose the first single for But Seriously, he chose Another Day in Paradise because it was different from what he'd released in the past. The label wanted something else. He wanted to be seen as a serious musician, so he put it out. Another Day in Paradise, it debuted on the Hot 100 at number 43 on the week of November 4th, 1989. Just 7 weeks later, it was at number 1. Stayed there for 4 weeks. It made Another Day in Paradise the last number 1 hit of the 80s, and also the first number 1 hit of the 90s. It's kind of a cool accomplishment. A multi-decade number 1, if you will. There aren't a lot of artists who can boast that claim to fame. Now, if you're curious, Rupert Holmes did it with his number 1 hit, Escape the Pina Colada Song, as the 70s turned into the 80s. Actually, but there was a gap in between. Escape was at number 1 on December 29th, 1979, but it was bumped to number 2 by January 5th, 1980, with Casey and the Sunshine Band overtaking the top spot with Please Don't Go. However, by the next week, Escape was back at number 1.
If you like pina coladas, don't go away.
Santana's Smooth also scored a multi-decade number 1 with, that was in 1999 and 2000. And actually Escape, if you see in my story in my interview with Rupert Holmes, he really was at number 1 at that time, but the record labels kind of messed up with that. Look that up if you want to see it. What Santana did was an even rarer honor because it was also multi-century and multi-millennium. Pretty crazy. But back to Another Day in Paradise. In addition to topping the Billboard Hot 100, the song also went to number 1 on the US Adult Contemporary chart, and it went to number 7 on the mainstream rock chart. Internationally, Another Day in Paradise reached number 11 in Australia, number 9 in Spain, number 8 in France, number 5 in New Zealand, and it hit number 2 in Denmark, Austria, Italy, Ireland, and also the United Kingdom. It also claimed number 1 in Canada, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Portugal, Belgium, Finland, Sweden, Norway, West Germany, and Zimbabwe. It was a massive worldwide hit. So much so that homeless charities across the world flooded Phil with requests to use Another Day in Paradise for their campaigns. Now, the music video was shot entirely in black and white and features Collins singing against a dark background. Throughout the video, you see image after image of homeless individuals and families from around the world. It also features messages and statistics about the homeless to drive home the song's plea to just think about it. The video, that was nominated for a Grammy Award for Best Music Video Short Form. However, it lost to Paula Abdul and her furry animated cohort MC Scat Cat in Opposites Attract. That took home the award. Yeah, there you go. The song did win Collins a Grammy for Record of the Year at the 1991 award ceremony, though. And Another Day in Paradise also won an award for Best British Single at the 1990 Brit Awards. However, despite the accolades, not everybody was exactly thrilled with the song's success. To some, it smacked of massive hypocrisy. Seeing Collins decked out in a Versace suit at the Brit Awards and listening to him lecture his wealthy peers about homelessness, some people thought it was in bad taste. And Phil Collins would actually talk about it as his memoirs. He said, and I quote, "In my acceptance speech, I feel it's only right that I make a nod to the lyrical content of the song. I point out how we all grumble about first world problems, but that's nothing. To me, it's pretty reasonable as a broad stroke comment about the sentiments that inspired Another Day in Paradise. I'm counting myself as a normal bloke and how this is just another day for you and me compared to the plight of those poor souls on the streets with cardboard boxes for beds." End of quote. And man, I remember this. It was bad. Critics piled on Phil Collins. They ripped him apart, believing his serious wealth, should disqualify him from singing a song about how difficult it is to be poor. Then others accused Collins of exploiting homelessness and looking to profit off of it. But when you think about it, the song wasn't written from the perspective of the homeless. Collins wasn't saying, "I know what it feels like to be homeless or poor." In the song, we see through the eyes of Phil Collins and his struggle to come to grips with those who were suffering around him. It's about choosing not to turn a blind eye anymore. He even admits that he did. That's a perspective that Phil, frankly, is qualified to sing about. I just didn't get the backlash. People didn't listen to the song. Collins responded to the criticism by pointing out that when he drives down the street, he sees the same things everyone else sees. In his words, it's a misconception that if you have a lot of money, you're somehow out of touch with reality. Phil at least was trying to do something, talk about it in the song, bring ears to it. In terms of pop culture media, Another Day in Paradise, it's almost 100% missing in action. Surprising for such a popular song. Made appearances in Charmed and Femme Fatales, but that's about it. As far as covers go, less than 6 months after the release of Phil's original, German dance act Jamtronic, they issued a version as their debut single. In the UK, the song peaked at number 19 on the singles chart. Later, Another Day in Paradise would also be covered by Real Big Fish, Three Doors Down. David Crosby did it as well, Keith Urban and Kelly Clarkson.
It's another day for you and me in paradise. You and me in paradise.
Now, in case you're interested, But Seriously would feature 3 more top 5 singles. Radio earworms that are still in our head today. I Wish It Would Rain Down, Something Happened on the Way to Heaven, great song. And Do You Remember? Another great song. Seriously, it's kind of an underrated album.
Rain down, down on me. Please believe in me. Do you remember?
But Seriously would close out the 80s as Phil Collins' second #1 album and 4th multi-platinum record, selling 4 million copies in the US and 14 million worldwide. This actually bumped Collins up to roughly 80 million 80s albums sold between his solo records and Genesis. 80 million in the 80s, I love it. Like I say, Phil was everywhere back in the day. Now, going into the 90s, Phil would continue his onslaught on mainstream radio, to a lesser extent. Playing his last album, Tyler released Serious Hits Live in 1990, a 15-track in-concert greatest hits affair. Then in 91, Collins teamed up with his Genesis bandmates once again for We Can't Dance, another blockbuster album. It would feature 5 top 25 hits, including the number 7 smash I Can't Dance. Then it was back to solo Phil to round out the 90s as Collins released Both Sides of the Story. That was in 1993, Dancing in the Light in 96, Hits in 98, the Greatest Hits compilation, and the Tarzan soundtrack in 99. Love Strangers Like Me from Tarzan. In all, Uncle Phil turned out 8 more top 40 solo hits in the 90s. Definitely a slowdown from his 80s pace. And none of his records really came close to matching the success of But Seriously or No Jacket Required. But Seriously was really his last commercial powerhouse album. But you gotta give the man credit. Phil Collins has put together one of the most impressive careers in music history. One of my favorite artists ever. Let me know if you want to hear more about Phil Collins and or Genesis in the 90s. Both are usually pretty popular on the channel. And we really haven't touched on this era for either of them. Might be fun to delve into that period of Phil's career. Let me know. But still, the man is an institution. In the present day, Another Day in Paradise has become Phil Collins' most streamed song ever. Hard for people to believe. More than Sussudio, more than In the Air Tonight. It's because young people, they've been listening to it on Instagram and TikTok. Who would have thought a song about homelessness by Phil Collins would be his biggest hit? You got me. Hey, leave us a comment about Phil Collins' Another Day in Paradise. I think it's that first part that really grabs people, kids from the 90s, that nostalgia of that first musical bed right there. I've seen it a lot lately. Have you? Let's have a great discussion about what do you think? Was he qualified to talk about homelessness and the issue of us raising a blind eye to it? Let me know. Let's have a great discussion. If you like our content, we invite you to subscribe. We would love to have you as part of our community. Till next time, my friends, 3 chords and the truth.